Good morning, where I am. So this has been going around a lot on X and on the internet lately because of a interview that Tucker Carlson had with Daryl Cooper, in which he specifically
Good morning.
mentioned, or at least he committed the cardinal sin in the post-war consensus, which is criticizing or even questioning any aspect of the official narrative of World War II, that it was a completely black and white conflict, that everything the Allies did was completely justified, and anything that the Axis did was completely unjustified. Namely, him criticizing Winston Churchill for not accepting the peace offering, and how he conducted the war. So, to talk more broadly about the narrative of World War II, how it shaped uh, the political consensus up till today, I have my friend Argent and I have my friend Serp. So, how's it going?
Good, thanks for having me on, man. You saved me because I was going to have to do a stream on this at some point, just because it's going around so much.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I wanted to talk about this because I initially wanted to make a video on it too, or a rant, but I feel like I needed some people that also have a historical background. Because now, when I was a teenager, I was a big wereaboo, so I was reading tons and tons of books on World War II already. Um, but uh, it's not my favorite historical period, but it's obviously the most important and relevant to today because, in a way, I call it it's the modern West's religion. Like when Churchill, Roosevelt, and Stalin are the Trinity, 1945 is like the switch over from BC to AD. Hitler is Satan, and I think in the Daryl Cooper interview, he even made the point of, or there was a French historian on um, the history of religion who had the theory that religions kind of start with a blood sacrifice, and in World War II, it was kind of, you could either say it was the Holocaust or it was the death of Hitler. He was the sacrificial lamb or goat that was needed to usher in the new world order in which the only acceptable form of government is liberal democracy, secularism, and social liberalism. And so the idea of anybody questioning it, and not even the questioning the narrative of what the Germans did to a certain group of people, it's basically questioning anything about the narrative. Now, I will say this is that there is one aspect, like you are allowed to criticize uh, America's treatment of the Japanese, but that's because the Japanese weren't white, although they were considered white by Hitler.
If I could just quickly, something I found funny is how China was part of it, rather than the big three at the time, it was the big four. But because we've switched recognition to the PRC, Chiang Kai-shek has been kind of non-personed. Um, so it's just those three now, and he's excluded.
Mm-hmm. And I think also people are too stupid to know about China in World War II. People
No,
probably.
just a brief side note that I always found
Mm-hmm.
interesting.
Well, namely, I think. I mean, a lot of the more the usual suspects that came out against it were a lot of the normie Christian leaders. My old nemesis Russell Moore, who is the guy that, fun fact, I made my first video on this channel about, who's like a one of the big leaders in the Southern Baptist Convention and is completely woke on like race and everything. And I think was it you, Argent, that pointed this out, or somebody like hit him saying no, World War II was pretty black and white, and posts like a Marvel comic from the 40s, and it's like, okay, so your understanding of World War II comes from a fictional superhero comic. And I think that's largely how people's perspective really exists anyway, where you know as good as a film as Saving Private Ryan is, like, its portrayal of the Germans as just completely ruthless, soulless monsters is not. It shapes everybody's understanding, where they call everybody that was a German or in the Axis a Nazi, even though really that's not how it worked. Your thoughts?
Do you want to go, Serp?
Well, I definitely think that we have a problem with what I like to talk about when it comes to this sort of thing is that you have history that's politicized and history that's unpoliticized. And it doesn't matter how far away that history is. So, the Vietnam War, I feel like, is something which is not politicized. Desert Storm, and even increasingly the 2003 invasion of Iraq in historiography are becoming less and less politicized. While World War II, ending, what was it now,
80 years
79
ago.
years
Yeah.
ago, remains significantly more politicized than almost any single event in the entirety of the Cold War, and even say the second Bush's presidency, and that the entire edifice of liberal democracy and somewhat relatedly, Israel's existence is justified through certain narratives about what happened in that conflict, which aren't necessarily true because they're like propagandistic about things like the idea that any kind of negotiation with your opponent is wrong,
Mm-hmm.
calling people Neville Chamberlain for saying that for any kind of negotiation, belief that every single victory has to be total, that you can't negotiate a settlement with an opponent, that you can't even like you have to put your
When you talk
enemies
to your
on
enemies,
trial.
they win.
You
Mm-hmm.
talk to your enemies, they win. You have to put all your opponents on trial, and that's what's going on with Serbia right after the war. Enemy non-combatants in the conflicts in the Middle East, executing Saddam, failure to negotiate whatsoever with Russia in the Ukraine war.
Mm-hmm. I was
That
gonna
all
bring that up.
comes
Is
from this idea about German the Germans in World War II being some kind of intolerable, unbelievable satanic evil, and
I'd say also the fake legalization of international affairs, where we have the rules-based international order, and like we have to pretend everything that like is following some legal code. I
well,
feel is something that
Mhm.
came out of World War II as
and
part
I
of
think.
just
Sorry, go ahead.
as part of the whole Nuremberg, and as you said, the need to try whenever an opponent loses, it's not just that they lost, it's that they were evil and we have to put them in jail like a common criminal.
This
Mhm.
didn't even originate out of World War II though. Is World War One? You saw the origins of this, right? As well, is that like I think by 1917, Germany would have probably been much more willing to negotiate a negotiated peace, and by the time the United States entered the war, they were never going to accept anything other than unconditional surrender. And even after that, they were furious with the Dutch government for giving asylum to the Kaiser because, you know, even though it wouldn't have actually done anything, like, out of nothing else but, you know, the origin of we have to try all of our enemies is we have to make a humiliating example out of him, so we need to bring him over to France to give him a show trial and then publicly execute him.
Yeah, I mean, World War One, of course, ended with a negotiated settlement, and Germany was never occupied. But I think that you're right that there's seedlings there towards,
Mm-hmm.
you know, the execution of Saddam, the executions at Nuremberg.
Mm-hmm. Where, yeah, it's something that's about liberal democracies in the modern world that, like, anything that isn't complete and total capitulation is seen as an existential threat to them.
Interestingly, if you go back to what could arguably be the First World War, France was not dismembered after Napoleon was removed from power.
No.
And they didn't dismember France even after Napoleon's 100 Days. I mean, France lost a lot of its territory, but I think it was largely back to whatever its pre-war size was, minus a couple strategic mountain passes. So, like, the idea of completely mangling and just destroying your opponent, I mean, that happens sometimes, but I feel like that just became the norm.
Mm-hmm. anything less than total victory is unacceptable, and
Mm-hmm.
the conditions of the victory, just the way people, because something I've of course talked about is that a lot is what people don't understand is like, so this is going to be unpopular in these circles, but what, like, I'm going to be blunt because this isn't monetized. I believe the Holocaust happened. The exact number, who cares? I still think there was a deliberate attempt to kill the Jews, but at the same time, after the war, there was a deliberate attempt to kill as many German civilians as possible, particularly in the East, obviously. Like, what happened in Prussia and in the Baltic, and like people that were Danube and Volga Germans was a genocide. And that's completely overlooked and seen as completely acceptable. As is, like, the firebombing of Dresden and the nuking of nuking of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, because, well, the end justifies the means if we're going to have liberal democracy win, so we can commit whatever war crimes we want. Hello?
Yeah, I mean, there definitely is this denial's not the right word, but there is definitely this idea that the West didn't really commit war crimes during World War II. I don't know if
Because they're evil and subhuman.
the Germans and the Japanese and the Italians.
Yes.
Just like the Russians are apparently now. Russians have never done anything to me personally, but because they invaded a country thousands of miles away, that means they're just like they're not people. They have no rights. We can kill as many of them as possible.
It is very much how they talk about like unpersoning the other or dehumanizing the other, because it's removing any kind of moral agency, any kind of rationality, any kind of inherent worth of the other as a human being. Which I just find that's often the case during World War II. It's just Germany was 100% bad. It's not even like they will try to explain why they are bad in any real sense. It's just mustache man bad.
Or they're even going to they'll it often even went to, well, these people are just genetically evil because like. There was one, like, World War II propaganda video I saw from the U.S., and it was just like, this obviously falsified version of German history where they're just always bloodthirsty conquerors, from the Dark Ages, and then, like, Bismarck in the Franco-Prussian War was, the exact same thing, or that, the Kaiser was basically Hitler in World War I.
Oh, yeah, I know PragerU did that, where they said that the German government in World War I was fascist. And we had to go to war in World War I to save the world from fascism. I know people still refer, like, there was some article where they referred to the Russian army as the Red Army. I was reading.
Very, very, very astutely, very astute of them. But yeah, it's I mean, that's what we live in. I mean, it's been long enough that nobody really, like, the average person doesn't know anything about World War I and very little about World War II. But yeah, and again, I think it also just comes. I think it influenced like pop culture and the fact that American World War II movies have to be these like completely good versus evil, no nuance to it. Which is why I think the German movies about World War II are actually a lot better, like Das Boot or the German Stalingrad, because, I mean, or Downfall, because they're a lot more kind of melancholic and nuanced. Like, them showing Hitler as both, like, the raving lunatic, but also as, like, kind of kind-hearted humanist that loves dogs and had a bit of a sense of humor. Like, the fact that movie got made when it did is actually really amazing.
Do you watch that many movies that were made, say, before Saving Private Ryan or Schindler's List?
No.
In the United States about World War II?
Aren't they just kind of...
So,
go ahead.
So what you notice is that the closer you get to World War II in terms of American movies being made, the more honorable German soldiers are.
Mm.
The When you have veterans of World War II, and I'm sure that there are some veterans left that are very old right now, but when there is more and more input into movies where veterans were still around, these movies depicted Germans as very brave or stuck in is honorable. The cause is wrong, but they're depicted as brave and honorable.
Mm-hmm.
But as time goes on and more veterans of World War II pass away, these movies transfer into, and they're not necessarily, the older movies are not necessarily more historically accurate in terms of like, they'll have, they'll take, say, like, I think it's M48 Pattons, and they'll just paint them gray or green depending on which side. They won't have accurate
Which I'm
tanks
okay
or
with
accurate
that.
equipment.
I think
But
that was my biggest problem when I watched the George C. Scott Patton movie. Is like
yeah,
those Panzers don't look anything like Panzer IVs.
oh yeah, there definitely what was a less effort to create artificial or
Trying to,
mock-ups of accurate equipment, or to try and like have refurbished equipment from World War II present in these movies. But once you get past that inaccuracy, that these movies aren't very much morality plays with evil Germans. They're movies about the war and what happened.
which yeah, now looking back, yeah, like A Bridge Too Far or Patton, you're completely right. Aren't like these, propaganda, basically propaganda movies. They're like there is nuance in them actually, but as opposed to I don't know, something like Monuments Men or the
Oh,
or
Inglorious
um,
Bastards.
yeah, I was
Inglorious
gonna,
Bastards.
which
Torrentino one.
I mean, Inglorious Bastards, even though obviously it's, hey, they kill Hitler at the end, so, that's going to have implications.
It's a really disgusting movie, to be
it's,
honest.
it's, it's basically revenge porn.
Just on top, just a quick point on the whole movie portrayal. I think honestly, and this is what I like to say, the pause test is whether or not you think the movie Zulu is racist. Because I think it very much like portrays the Zulus as honorable opponents, and it's
Yes.
about the warrior code. And if anything, it's like when governments are done having us kill each other, we're still ultimately humans.
I mean, they have a whole scene where they're with the Zulu king, and he seems like a very honorable, warrior.
Yeah, like there's also an attitude of like, why are these random Englishmen in the middle of nowhere? But my point is like that I think is a good example of something where they're the enemy, they're the other, but they aren't like just complete monsters.
Mm-hmm. Like there's the idea that the propaganda at some point has to be put away, and obviously these people aren't subhumans. But then in World War II, you started having that happen. You had the propaganda didn't really seem to go away in terms of Allied policy. Like they're like, yeah, Germans have lived east of the Oder for hundreds and hundreds of years, but it's perfectly fine to murder SA and displace them all. Which
Yeah, I'm gonna.
go ahead.
Oh, sorry, go on.
No, go ahead.
I'm just gonna say something that might piss a lot of people off. I get why they wanted to expel all the Germans from Eastern Europe, because in the era of nation states being based on ethnicity and nationality, they are basically a third column, and there's always a fear that a future German government will try to invade on the grounds of incorporating those areas, which is kind of the issue that a lot of countries are having with Russians. Post-Soviet countries have with Russians who settled there. I'm not justifying it. I'm just saying, from that, there is a particular logic to it. It's also so just wanted to throw that up there.
Yeah, what I was gonna say is that and I said this back when I think it was a little under a year ago when Yaroslav Hunko, got the standing ovation in Canadian Parliament, and we have to admit that the Russians do this, like, the Russian cope with this is also kind of disgusting of, oh, all our enemies are Nazis in the Ukraine war, and, like, we want to extradite this, like, 98-year-old Ukrainian in Canada for, like, war crimes. But, like, with that, and people are like, well, no, the decision of, you know, who the good guy and bad guy is in World War II was easy. And I'm thinking, okay, if you're English, you know, and it's 1941, yes, it's actually going to be easy. Okay, you know, Churchill, good guy, Hitler, bad guy. Okay, let's say you're German, and you know that, well, the Americans and British are flying bombers over your city and killing your neighbors, and you know that if Stalin and the Red Army win, you know, your whole family is going to be raped, murdered, and displaced. So, you know, who's the bad guy and who's the good guy in that situation?
Well, it's just I just thought of a random example. So, like the Roman Parthian Wars or the Sassanid Wars. There's no real attempt or need to try to make it like a good guy or a bad guy. It's just two great powers going at it for control over Armenia and the Middle East. There isn't really any moral dimension to it whatsoever. Um, just as kind of I don't know, I just figured I'd throw that out there as an example of how
Mm-hmm.
like you can have wars where there isn't a it's just a purely historical event.
Or, yeah, where, like, the idea of if the other side wins, it's literally the end of the world. As opposed to, well, this is like a small conflict that, you know, even if you lose, you can recover from.
Yeah, so sorry if I could just I kind of just kind of maybe for the next topic. So something I always wonder about, and our side is also kind of guilty of this, is there a need to continually relitigate World War II? Because I feel like this is a trap that we always get pulled into, where liberals start talking about Nazis, and then a bunch of Spurgs feel that they have to defend it or try to like do historical
Revisionism?
revisionism or some I don't I actually don't someone pointed out the term historical revisionism is kind of bad because you should always be revising history, but trying to politicize it in the opposite way, and if it's something we should even talk about, I just throwing that out there as kind of
I
a
mean, I think in this specific aspect, because Old Glory Club was talking about it a couple days ago because they watched the interview, is that, you know, this is one of the major pillars of liberalism, is that the narrative of World War II was we were the good guys, they were the bad guys, and that any alternative to liberal democracy is the Nazis. Like, you know, every, like, in
like
when
Trump is somehow a Nazi.
that, or even going earlier than that, that okay, the Soviets are like the Nazis now, or, you know, after 9/11 there was like, well, we have like the new axis of evil of North Korea, Iran, and
Oh, the
Iraq.
Islamo-Nazi or the Islamo-fascist?
Islamo-fascist.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Or like, yeah, George Bush like literally calling them like the axis of evil, right? So that in every conflict there has to be this evil genocidal Hitler figure. Now, to be fair, okay, Saddam was that, but, you know, invading Iraq accomplished really nothing.
Well, things got way worse after he was
Yes.
uh,
The
removed
irony,
from
of course,
power.
being that when liberal democracies intervene, they end up causing genocides as well because of what happened to, you know, the Assyrian Christians in Iraq.
The Yazidis and the Madans.
Yeah.
So when you go to talk about World War II and you talk about Hitler and you talk about the consequences of the Allies winning the war, ideologically, is that Hitler is made into a great Satan figure, and any deviation to the right of Roosevelt is now associated with Hitler onwards, regardless of how close a libertarian, like an anarcho-capitalist, is to Nazism, how close that Trump's policies are to Nazism, or Putin's policies, or even at points the Soviets. to Nazism, that all these different enemies are associated with Nazism, and as time goes on, Nazism's ideology has changed and been divorced from a pan-German context. Nazism is, of course, National Socialism, and it's abbreviated into Nazism. It's a German ideology. It's devoted to trying to form all the Germans together into one state, Gross Deutschland, in opposition to the minority of the Jews in that country, and kind of a third positionist, fascist economic worldview, but also this idea of revanchism against France and against Poland for their defeat, and the idea that Germany needs to expand eastwards. Well, let's compare, say, paleoconservatism or say white racial identity. Somehow, these completely different ideologies are interspersed and made into Nazism for political convenience. So Hitler's National Socialist racialism is defined as
It's really
a brand
weird.
of Nordicism, where Germanic peoples are the highest, but other European peoples, which we know genetically are extremely similar, so say Slavs. In fact, I believe that like Russians who come from the area around St. Petersburg are going to have a higher
They're
amount
more
of blonde
descendant
hair
of-
and blue
yeah.
eyes and lighter features than Bavarians or Austrians. But within Hitler's brand of Nordicism, they weren't very genetically based, and they were not based around what would cluster into racial groups today. They were not pan-white nationalists.
Didn't a lot of scientific racialists at the time like denounce them as their theories being kind of crackpotish?
Yeah.
Mhm. And then
I think. Oh, sorry. One just
yeah,
one quick
going
thing.
on
I
to
think
that is that like this is a slight tangent, but it's this type of thinking of making Nazism such a broad definition also applies into the pants on the head retarded concept that well, the Nazis and the communists were basically the same thing because they were both socialists. Because
socialism.
the boomer right did the exact same thing of, well, Obama is like Hitler because socialism.
So, and I was asking people about this on Twitter, and I got a couple responses, but I think the core ideological concept, I think National Socialism is incoherent in a lot of ways, but I think the undeniable core aspect of it is German ultranationalism. And if it's not an, if somebody is not a German ultranationalist, I kind of feel they can't be a National Socialist because that's the underlying assumption more than any kind of economic system or like if you get into other forms of fascism, there's a much, I think, more coherent worldview. Where in National Socialism, it's very much, and you can see this in like how the Japanese are Aryans of the East, or the Finns are like Nordic now, or whatever. It's just whatever is good for German power at that particular time.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, something else is that after the war, you have all this like German victory or like a Nazi continuous uh, fiction, and Nazis are always anti-black in these movies. So say Wolfenstein: The New Colossus, or
Which is basically about which I think isn't that just basically about as much like revenge porn as Inglorious Bastards is.
Yeah, I never played that game.
Yeah.
I didn't have the heart to play
It
it.
doesn't
And then
seem
you have
fun.
Man in the High Castle,
Mm-hmm. Where the
and
Japanese like banned Christianity in America, even though in 1940 they officially stated that Christianity is one of the official religions of Japan, along with Buddhism and Shinto.
yeah, I think that has to do with Philip K. Dick's original novel and him being such a idiosyncratic writer.
Mm-hmm.
I do believe that the original novel is a masterpiece. I've never seen the TV series because I don't have the heart to.
I
Again,
saw a couple episodes.
this is making me sound like a poser, but what's the one where the Nazis live on the moon?
Iron
It's like a
Skies.
really bad. Yeah, Iron Sky, where they're like anti-black.
Like, I think they would have. I mean, I'm pretty sure they wouldn't. Didn't they want to just expel like the small number of like mixed race, like when the French had some of their African soldiers in the Rhineland or in the Ruhr? Were there like some mixed race children as a result of that?
I don't know. I don't know if that's just propaganda, but it's just it's very tailored towards the ideology changing over time to suit liberalism as a satanic ideology.
Contemporary American politics.
Mm-hmm.
No, Fehar. Tojo was not a Christian. The leader of Unit 731 was a convert, though.
Didn't Yamamoto convert to Catholicism too?
I'm not sure. I know there was like one of the heads of whoever conducted one of the architects of Pearl Harbor, or one of the fighter pilots, converted as well. Oh, Tojo converted post-war. Okay. But yeah, like, people don't talk about the fact that Nagasaki was like kind of the hub of Christianity in Japan at the time, and that got wiped out. And it really just fascinates me because, like, you're not allowed to. It seems like on both sides you're not allowed to criticize the atomic bombing, because so it was actually fascinating when Catholic Answers, which is as normie Catholicism as you can get, had a video saying no, it was actually completely unjustified, and they even brought up the bombing of Dresden as unjustified as well. But everybody has to say, well, no, the ends justify the means, which again feeds back into the whole liberalism in war has to have complete and total victory on at all costs.
Yeah. Do you want to talk about the origins of World War II?
Sure. Yeah, if you can take it away.
Okay, so because World War II is kind of apotheosized into the ultimate battle of good versus evil in liberal ideologies, a lot of people forget about how World War II happened. There's this idea that Germany was a purely aggressive entity, which was hell-bent on
global domination.
Global domination, and that the origins of World War II have nothing to do with territorial disputes between Germany that happened after their defeat in the First World War. And there's also this idea of appeasement, which is the most ahistorical thing, one of the most ahistorical things ever. This idea that the Western powers caused World War II through appeasement.
Mm-hmm. That they should have just declared war immediately when they remilitarized the Rhineland or wanted the Sudetenland.
Sorry, just a side note. I've heard that the military situation was actually worse for the Allies at the time. And if they had have done that, it would have been even more of a mess. I don't know if that's true or not.
At what point? In 36 or in 38?
38.
Yeah, I mean, part of the problem here is that so appeasement is universalized throughout all of history, like in retrospect on to what actually happened. And so it's like, yeah, there was so-called appeasement at the Munich conference, but then after that, they didn't have any appeasement with Hitler, and that's what led to World War II, where they had war over the corridor with Poland. But, before that, I mean, we're having appeasement with the Soviet Union, with their conquest of Poland and their changing of the borders in Eastern Europe after that, right? It's just kind of like universalized, and you can't have negotiations over any territory or negotiations with a opposition power, period, in any way whatsoever.
Wasn't it also partially a practical concern to give Britain time to start rearming? Um,
Well,
I
what,
don't know about that. I mean, I guess I don't know that much about rearmament following that.
I don't. I
Here,
just
just a
remember
second.
hearing that somewhere. I don't know specific details.
Mhm.
Sorry, go on, sir. I interrupted you.
Here, just a second.
But I guess it can transition into the idea that, so in 1940, after the fall of France, and even before then...
Yeah, I had to let my cat out there. I'm sorry. So... So what ended up happening, right, what led into World War II, is that Germany started forming Großdeutschland. We started out with the occupation of the Sudetenland, annexation of Saars,
Austria.
annexation of Austria, and then a border dispute over...
Klapedia with Lithuania.
Well, yeah, that comes after the dispute over the Sudetenland and Czechoslovakia. Sorry, I meant to say the occupation of the Rhineland, not the occupation of Sudetenland.
Mm-hmm.
And so,
What was the justification for seizing the rest of Czechoslovakia?
so basically, what happened is that Czechoslovakia collapsed after the Munich Agreement.
Mm-hmm.
And Hitler, so the Germans were supporting Slovenian independence to collapse the state.
Mm-hmm.
So when they started, not Slovenian, Slovakian. I'm sorry, I have a nasal congestion.
Yeah, it's all
So
right.
they started supporting Slovakian independence, and because all the defensive positions and military of the state was so compromised, and because Slovakians were agitating towards independence, Czechoslovakia was basically an incoherent state. And so the leader, I can look up his name, of Czechoslovakia, basically approached Hitler and asked for the occupation of the Czech half, and the Nazis went into the country without resistance and created a allied Slovakia and made Bohemia proper a protectorate.
Okay.
And also Poland, Hungary, I think also took pieces.
Yes, that's part of the problem is that when Munich happened, when the Munich Agreement happened, the Munich Agreement is where France, Italy, because Italy at this point wasn't necessarily pro-German from 33 until the Munich Agreement. They weren't necessarily pro-German. There was actually a pretty big dispute over the German annexation of Austria because Italy didn't want that to happen. They actually were anti-German up until that point. And Hitler, is it South Tyrol? Is that the part of
Yeah.
the German
Yeah.
ethnic part of? Yeah, so Hitler agreed to not contest over South Tyrol during the annexation of Austria, and this led to a rapprochement between Mussolini and Hitler, and Mussolini became increasingly pro-German after Mussolini and Fascist Italy being anti-National Socialist, anti-German, anti-Hitler. And so at the Munich Agreement, the dispute over the Sudetenland was settled between United Kingdom, France, Italy, and Germany, which would allow the Germans to take the ethnic borderlands of, I guess, Czechia. I usually try and call it Bohemia now. And that Germany had promised not to invade the country. But because the country was basically incoherent and Germany undermined its independence by supporting Slovakian independence, that led to the prime minister of Czechoslovakia conceding the German occupation without a fight, which led France and the United Kingdom to feel they had a casus belli. But part of the problem with Munich is that Poland and Hungary weren't invited, and Poland and Hungary, when the Germans occupied Western, well, not
Bohemian
West, I mean
Moravia.
Western, but Bohemia, when they occupied Bohemia proper, Poland and Hungary intervened to take slices of Czechoslovakia as well. And part of the reason Czechoslovakia was not a coherent entity that could continue after the annexation of the Sudetenland is both Hungary and Poland were revisionist powers who wanted their own parts of that country.
Because going to war over Czechoslovakia, or occupying the rest of Czechoslovakia, would have been in conflict with both Hungary and Poland.
Yep.
Okay.
Which, and so it was really difficult. We don't look at this in retrospective, but trying to maintain Czechoslovakia was really difficult for Western powers because they couldn't, every single state which bordered Czechoslovakia wanted Czechoslovakian territory. And so they couldn't like have a grand alliance of Poland and Hungary against a revisionist Germany because Poland and Hungary also wanted parts of Czechoslovakia.
There's a lot of revisionists. Like, I find that's completely the slice Poland took is either overlooked or there's some cope about it.
Yeah, one of the best books to read, I mean, it's slightly naughty, is the book The Origins of World War II, which talks about this in detail. It's a pretty controversial book, though.
Is part of why Italy switched sides because the what became the Western Allies just like tried to put sanctions on them and gave them a bunch of shit over the invasion of Ethiopia.
Yeah, I mean, Britain was both anti-Italy and anti-Germany, which pushed them together. I mean, I think there's truth there. That book, by the way, The Origins of the Second World War, is written by the English historian A.J.P. Taylor. It's a very good book, which I feel that everyone needs to read to understand the Second World War. Of course, once Czechoslovakia collapsed due to the German occupation of Bohemia and Moravia proper, the British and French had already attempted to have some kind of peace and rapprochement with Germany through the so-called appeasement. And so they really had casus belli to go to war with Germany because both these states felt threatened by Germany, who's rapidly expanding with taking Austria, the Sudetenland, Bohemia and Moravia, and Saar, and then of course they bully Lithuania to give them Wilma. I hope I pronounced it right.
I think it's a
I thought it was
is it that
Memel.
state? No, it's Memel. I'm sorry, wrong city. So they bullied Lithuania to give them Memel. So by the time that Germany, within a span of less than 2 years, is demanding the corridor and Danzig from Poland or war, Britain and France feel that they have casus belli and justification to go to war over Poland over such an aggressive external enemy. But of course, what ultimately happened is that France and Britain went to war for the territorial integrity of Poland when Poland ultimately becomes a puppet power of the Soviet Union. So in retrospective, after the war, they have to change the entire justification of the war to be about defeating the cosmic evil of Nazism, rather than trying to maintain the territorial integrity of Europe and trying to maintain a balance of power within Europe, because the balance of power is completely destroyed after the Second World War, with the Soviet Union ultimately viewed by most of the world, even during World War II itself, with Western support for Finland during the Winter War, as just as bad as Germany, if not more of a threat, being the uncontested most powerful country in Europe, pushing significantly far westwards and controlling numerous puppet states all the way until East Germany itself, that far westwards.
Hmm.
Well, this is part of why it can't be viewed as a historical thing, because I mean, obviously, like to you, me, and everybody probably here, there was very practical reasons. Like if Britain was to declare war on the Soviets when they invaded Poland, like it would have accomplished nothing. The Soviet Union was um didn't
France or
directly
Britain.
border anybody. It might have pushed together some sort of alliance between the two. Likewise, post-war, they couldn't do it because it just wasn't realistic. I think though they don't want to admit that, um, even though I think it does make logical sense in a lot of areas. But
You also have the
I
fact
mean,
that Poland's borders did change significantly after the war anyway, and the fact that a huge chunk of their eastern territory, was swallowed up by the Soviet Union, and then they, in turn, got a huge amount of kind of arbitrary German land. Not even just the Oder, because Stettin is on the western side of the Oder, but they still said, yeah, just give it to Poland anyway.
yeah, I mean that's definitely undermines the original reason for the war. I was just going to comment on what Argent was saying though, because France and Britain debated deeply about going to war with the Soviet Union, and ultimately they didn't. There was a very popular idea of going to war with the Soviet Union over Finland and considering Germany and the Soviet Union as de facto allies on the basis of the division of Poland and deep sympathies with Finland. And after Poland was defeated, France and Britain thought that if the war was localized to Scandinavia, that would make it into more of a limited war. And this goes on with the whole phony war thing, where Germany and France are at war and over across the entirety of their borders, but they're not actively engaging in combat for months on end. And so after Poland was defeated, both Britain and France were like, well, what do we do now? We're still technically at war with Germany. And so they thought about trying to make, which is hilarious because they're at war with Germany, but they thought that if they would have intervened in Finland and the war that happened in Norway, the invasion of Norway, that would have somehow turned the war into a more limited affair in Scandinavia. Ultimately, of course, we know that that didn't work out because Germany did invade France and the Low Countries in Case Yellow and ultimately defeated all of them.
Hmm. Even though
so I
France
wanted
had a
to.
larger
Oh,
tank
sorry.
army than Germany at the time. But, yeah, it's less important the actual strategy. But, yeah, go ahead.
So I wanted to bring up Britain's war in World War II because I'm probably gonna. I don't know. It's probably. I always say it's gonna be controversial, but is it? I understand. So the British have always not wanted Europe to be united under one power, because if all of Europe's resources were husbanded by one person, they might be able to challenge their naval supremacy. There's also a unwillingness to have a hostile power in control of the English Channel, which is kind of the issue with why they always have a guarantee of independence on Belgium. I think, and Serp, you can correct me if I'm wrong, the fear that Britain had and why they didn't peace out after France fell was Germany was on a short timer because they had no way of getting enough oil to fuel their economy and war machine. And if the UK pieced out, then they could buy oil from Mexico or Venezuela or somewhere else and probably beat the Soviet Union, and then because of their industrial advantage, eventually build a fleet to um, challenge the UK. So I kind of feel like it did make rational political sense for them to not peace out. I don't know what you two guys think.
Yeah, I was going
Sorry
to
if
get
that
on
was a
to that.
bunch of stuff.
Because, just very briefly, is, yes, between the fall of Poland and the fall of France, and immediately afterwards, uh, Germany did make, or Hitler did make, very sincere peace pleas to Britain with the idea of, like, we don't even want our old colonies back. You can just keep the empire. Just let us have continental Europe. And so you could criticize that Churchill should have, accepted that and not, expanded the war. But at the same time, like, if, given the sentiment at the time, and with, say, just after the evacuation of Dunkirk, if Churchill had somehow said, yeah, we're going to accept peace, wouldn't he have immediately just been ousted from power by somebody that wouldn't? Like, what is he supposed to do? And I think there's also the fact that there was a very legitimate fear that even if they accepted peace and then Germany went on to destroy the Soviet Union, what was going to stop them from then just going
Well,
turning
Germany
around?
didn't really have a history of adhering to international agreements.
Mm-hmm. I mean, it was kind of one of their reasons, was that I think they liked Hitler is just because he was just basically telling the whole international agreements to fuck off.
Well, I mean, how could you trust him? I mean,
Yeah.
if you were the UK and Hitler makes all these promises, I mean, you've heard it all before. I do think, and kind of my issue with the interview is I think the idea, and I hope this isn't straw manning him, that the war continued because Hitler was a psycho. Sorry, not Hitler. Churchill was a psychopath who wanted to kill people. I don't know if that's a straw man or not. That seems kind of going in the opposite direction of trying to go like bald man bad.
I I think that basically, yeah, Churchill continued the war, right? Was it June or July that France officially surrendered?
I think it was
In
July.
July 1940 until June 1941, right, against Germany as the sole major power, with most of the war taking place in North Africa, and then the intervention in the Balkans, which saw Britain's allies quickly defeated there. Um, I
And the
think
Axis powers
that,
expand to, Romania and Bulgaria as well.
oh yeah, that yeah, Bulgaria and Romania proper both become, in Hungary all becoming allies against Germany, and Italy entering the war at the very end
You
against
mean
France.
against the Soviet Union?
Well,
But
no, I mean
against
because
Britain.
during the invasion of Yugoslavia, um, Hungary and Romania and Bulgaria all took the side of Germany and became Germany's de facto allies. And so
Mhm.
Britain, I mean, with Commonwealth allies and with like, the governments in exile of the Netherlands, Belgium, and France, they're standing against a much larger enemy: Germany, Italy, Hungary, Romania, and Bulgaria. So it seems foolish that Britain would continue on when they could have effectively a white peace. But I think you have to understand that I think that most of the British government believe that a peace between the Soviet Union and Germany was um, just a short period, and that they believed a wider war between the Soviet Union and Germany and its various allies was inevitable, and so that they were biding their time. The second thing is that immediately after the fall of France, the Battle of Great Britain and then the Battle of the Blitz happened. And these battles, anytime you bomb and attack civilian targets aerially, it causes the populace to actually support the war effort much more, and that's what happened. Once you have the Battle of Britain and the Blitz, the British populace, if they thought that continuing the war was pointless after their defeats in France and Norway, and being outnumbered on the continent, and the idea of trying to reinvade and take back France as being like suicidal and not worth the amount of manpower that would take, being bombed aerially during the Battle of Britain and the Battle of the Blitz was definitely something that galvanized the British public into support to continuing the war. And the other thing is that the battles in East Africa, which are kind of neglected and forgotten about, and the battles in North Africa until Rommel and the Africa Corps intervened, Britain took over all of East Africa against Italy, and then was defeating Italy pretty handedly in Libya.
Mm-hmm.
What
Um,
about my point that if they removed the blockade and let up, that was really their only leverage over Germany. And then if Germany decided to use the continent's resources, they'd just kind of be screwed.
Yeah, I mean, the idea of another war between Germany and Britain 10 years down the line, of course. I mean, I guess that's threatening, but I'm just kind of talking about the immediate situation between the fall of France and the invasion of the Soviet Union.
Hmm.
Obviously, once you have the invasion of the Soviet Union, there's no reason why Britain should leave the war and have some kind of peace proposal with Germany.
Hmm.
Just sorry, complete
Go ahead.
side note. If Britain had a peace deal, do you think the Germans would have won in the East?
If it's, I mean,
Define winning.
yeah, I think so. I've always been outspoken on if there was no Western Allied threat, that Germany would have defeated the Soviet Union. Germany and its various allies would have defeated the
I think
Soviet
their
Union.
core problem wasn't even like it was just a lack of oil, and they could have imported some.
I mean, I think that that's true, but I also think that I understand that Lend-Lease didn't come into effect after the Battle of Stalingrad, but I think that the ability of the Soviets to continue continued offensives against Germany with having very limited internal resources was greatly aided by Lend-Lease. I'll always stick by that.
Also,
I've
food
held that
because there was
opinion
a
my whole
famine.
life. Yeah, because of food and the mobility gains through the various trucks and other equipment given by the United States. But I think food is very important. We know that after the war ended, one of the most severe famines that the Soviet Union ever incurred was in the immediate post-war years after Lend-Lease ended.
Hmm.
So, had there not been American support for the Soviet Union, the Soviet war effort may have collapsed had the war turned into a war of attrition in centered around eastern Ukraine after the Battle of Stalingrad. I think that it would have went on for years, and ultimately the Soviet Union would not be capable of retaking its territory and invading Germany proper.
To go into just a bit of alternate history, just as a side tangent, I'm thinking that, like, one of the tragedies of World War II, especially, I guess, from kind of our side, our sphere, is that it seems like if anybody but Hitler had been in charge of Germany, they probably would have been able to unite Europe solidly against the Soviet Union. Like, if you had, I don't know, like a if you had like an even a more base Adenauer takeover in the 30s instead of Hitler, and was like, you know, we want to basically we want in exchange for we want some of our land back. You know, we will like launch a fight to destroy the Soviet Union. I think they could have gotten France, Poland, and like most of Europe on board with them in that case.
Yeah, I mean, think about how many people volunteered
Hmm. You probably would have had
to
a lot
fight.
more than that if it wasn't for like the if it wasn't for like because going into this right is that if you're in Eastern Europe or if you're in Europe in general, like the idea is okay, World War II is a conflict between Hitler and Stalin. That is not, as you know, the narrative says, an easy choice to make, right? It's you know, Hitler is more of an unknown quantity. Stalin is the devil we know, and so you know, you had people from you know the foreign volunteer SS divisions, you know, from everywhere from Norway, Flanders, and Albania and Bosnia, to even you know the Russian Liberation Army under Vlasov, which I think at its height had about 40,000 soldiers. Was like
Hmm.
this is our only chance to make Stalin go away, and like you know if you're in that position, I don't think that that probably was an easy choice, but in some cases it was, and I don't like downplay. I don't think it was like immoral or traitorous of them to do that. As in the same way, I don't think that you know any of the Russians or Ukrainians fighting for the Soviet Union, you know, when the Germans invaded, were like
I think there's
wrong.
arguments on both sides. There's
Mm-hmm.
fighting for the motherland versus the Soviets had just however you want to, for whatever reason, whether deliberate or incompetence or spite, caused a massive famine in Ukraine. So I can really see why they would want payback. Because, like, for instance, with the SS brigades, they were explicitly promised they wouldn't have to fight the Western Allies.
Mm-hmm.
They're like, we'll fight communists, but we aren't going to fight we don't have any beef with the British or Americans or French.
Mm-hmm.
Hmm. I think that had there been a Germany, which was, I mean, of course, Germany, once it started losing the war, at the very end, scrapped Lebensraum. But had you had a not as ideologically committed leader as Hitler, a more pragmatist leader who did want to give Ukraine and Belarus and especially the Baltic states, which are to me are very obvious. Why would Germany want to antagonize the Baltic states and and trying to forcibly conquer them? Um, that if they did not try to push towards a policy of Lebensraum and did not commit all the atrocities in Eastern Europe, that they would be able to gain quite a bit over the Soviets.
Like
The
they would
Croatians
have
were
been,
pretty
yeah.
loyal with the Germans
They would have been.
in
They would have had a lot of
Balkans.
solid allies as opposed to just having a small number that were kind of taking a chance of volunteering.
Yeah, they're definitely very ideologically committed to Lebensraum, which is one of the primary reasons for their defeat.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, but sorry, just to finish off what I was saying earlier. So I don't know. I don't entirely buy the some of the narrative. Just what do you two think about Churchill? You know what? I don't think we covered that exactly. Um,
Oh, I think that Churchill is very overinflated as a heroic figure. I think Churchill is an incredibly incompetent leader, and especially militarily shown time and again in both the First and Second World Wars.
He's
I
responsible for
think
Gallipoli,
that
wasn't he?
what?
He was responsible for Gallipoli, wasn't he?
Yes, he was responsible for Gallipoli. He was responsible for the invasion of Italy, which led to a very small German contingent giving very heavy casualties to the Western Allies, and he delayed it. He delayed the ultimate invasion of Western Europe right into 44. I know that if the invasion of Western Europe occurred in 43, that the Americans and the British and Canadians would have taken a lot more casualties, but the Soviet Union would have established less, let's say, a prominence
Mm-hmm.
with the various Warsaw Pact nations, and that the United States, we would have a lot less of the continent may have fallen under Soviet tyranny. I guess that's kind of up to what you think. If it's better for America and Britain to not sustain as many casualties at the cost of Poland and East Germany and Czechoslovakia and so on becoming communist states or not, but definitely had very poor planning, not a very likable person outside of the propaganda of World War II itself. And he's ultimately humiliated immediately after German defeat by being defeated in a landslide by Clement Attlee.
Mm-hmm. I think also just broadly is, I think he was a man of many talents. Like I have heard like his books on history are actually really good reads, if regardless of if they're that accurate or not. But at the same time, like he was a British nationalist. He was like a staunch British imperialist nationalist, um, and yet because of World War II, that did cause the final end of the British Empire. It had already sustained, had begun its decline after World War One, but I think there was no like moral case, and certainly not there wasn't the political or economic capital to uphold the empire anymore after World War Two.
Um, I I think part of that comes from directly allying with the United States for the
yeah, I
first
Yeah.
think
four
the
years.
U.S.
I
made
I
them their
think that
bitch.
I think Eisenhower threw Britain and France under the bus in Suez.
Yeah, I was about to say that was kind of the final nail in the coffin for them being kind of not under the thumb of the United States. Is
Yeah, I think the U.S. made them their bitch, to be blunt.
mm-hmm.
But
I think that if if the British stood up to the United States and said no, we'll fight over the Suez, I think Eisenhower might actually have backed down. But yeah,
And I like Eisenhower generally, but I think that was a scummy thing he did.
Was Churchill prime minister during the Suez Crisis?
No.
No. What year was it? It was like 50
56.
I think Churchill would have been prime minister.
He was prime minister again in the 50s, but it's the prime minister is losing in my head. It's Anthony Eden.
Okay.
He was the guy that took over after Churchill's second term.
Okay.
In the 50s.
Oh, sorry. But yeah, I think largely, I mean, unfortunately, because of the internet's incapability of understanding nuance, like, I don't think he was. I mean, everybody on the left normally just says, "Oh, because of the British Empire, Winston Churchill was like an evil racist or something." Until the right starts criticizing him, and then he becomes a hero. And he's also, again, he is one of like the gods of. Peter Hitchens even made this point, I think, in a debate once, where like the religion of Britain after World War II was just called "We won the war." Churchill was its god, the fighter pilot.
Yeah, I remember that book. Yeah.
And I think that was very much true, especially for boomers, right? He's very much kind of like. What's funny is I know my dad's one of his grandparents, like, who lived during World War II, really absolutely despised Franklin Roosevelt. Like, I don't think Roosevelt doesn't have the same kind of universal, or he doesn't have the same symbolic, love as somebody like Churchill does.
He's close.
Mm-hmm.
I think
lot of Americans
FDR
really
is more I think it's just nation by nation.
Mm-hmm.
I think Churchill is more attacked in revisionism, but FDR is more loved by Americans in general, and Churchill is going to be more loved by the British in general.
Mm-hmm. And then Stalin, of course, just kind of got memory hold after his death.
Or Uncle Joe?
Yeah.
Oh, the pro-Stalin stuff? Yeah.
Mm-hmm. I haven't seen it. I haven't seen the movie. Is The Death of Stalin a good movie?
I liked it.
It's terrible. Okay. It's like awful.
I liked that Serp didn't like it.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
I think is how to put it. It's a black comedy, which you may or may not like.
Yeah, I'm fine with that. I mean, it's got Jason Isaacs in it, so that's a plus.
Yeah, Zukov, that was good casting.
I think Steve Buscemi's in it too.
Yeah, he's Khrushchev.
Okay, so those are two good signs.
Actually, random side note, Zukov asked for a Christian burial.
Mm-hmm.
But it was denied to him.
Mm-hmm. I think because just on the Wikipedia, I think it says Zukov was an Orthodox Christian.
Yeah, well, it's, as I've said many times, high church tends to be very sticky. Mm-hmm. In that people tend to associate it with it even after secularism.
I know during the war, there was sort of a loosening up of the anti-religious sentiment in the Soviet Union, just as a way to try and
rally around the flag.
Yeah, and which ironically again it did make the Soviet Union, I think, almost kind of like a national socialist state, anyways, because Stalin was an ardent communist, but I think they understood, unlike the Trotskyites, he's like, we're not going to have like a world revolution. It's actually better just that we as the Soviet Union are the superpower. So basically what I'm saying is Nazgul gang rise up.
So,
Melenkov did ultimately convert to Eastern Orthodoxy after he was put in exile, and he served within the church.
As a reader.
Yes, and I think that the guy that played Melenkov, Jeffrey Tambor, was the best part of that movie.
Mm-hmm.
Go
ahead.
Yeah, wasn't it extremely brutally repressed under Khrushchev?
Yeah, the repression was let up from the war until Stalin's death, and then was again increased under Khrushchev of both the Orthodox and Unionite churches.
Mhm.
So what is the current narrative that's going on Twitter? Because I haven't really been able to follow it too much.
I think
So what's our side saying exactly?
I mean, I think our side is like, I think it largely depends because obviously it's somewhat split. Of, you know, I
Meat
think
socks?
maybe, but I think there's a lot of different ones. Obviously, the normie cons are all like, they love Winston Churchill almost as much as they love Ronald Reagan and Israel. Like I made this point that like a lot of evangelical leaders were going ahead and talking about it, and I said, it's so glad that they have their finger on the pulse of what really matters spiritually in America, which is not liking Winston Churchill enough. Distributist even made the point where he's like, it's weird that a lot of these Christian leaders are far more fine associating with people that deny the divinity of Jesus than they do with people denying the, you know, I guess divinity of Winston Churchill.
Or the right or Israel?
Yeah, because I know Churchill was a Zionist, right?
Yeah, in the interview he talked about how Jews bailed him out during his bankruptcy,
That's the
and
funniest part
Zionism
is
was.
like, what was the motive of the war? And Cooper's like giving this wry smile, like, I know what I want to say, but I can't say it on YouTube.
I personally, I don't know. He knows more than I do. I think he goes too hard on Churchill.
hmm
Honestly,
Yeah, I don't
like,
think he was I mean, he certainly would be a godsend if he was in charge of Britain today, because I don't think Winston
didn't he
Churchill.
run on the platform of keep Britain white?
Yes, but you're not allowed to talk about that. Um,
Okay.
but I'm saying is like, because Churchill, at the very least, which I guess is something that you can't say about most Western leaders now, is didn't seem to have utter and absolute contempt for his own people.
Yeah, like I just kind of view him as the leader of a great power. Um, who I think also when you're looking at historical leaders, you have to hindsight is 2020. So a lot of the decisions Hitler made, I think made sense at the time and things just didn't go that way. Like Tick did a video on just a slight digression on the super tanks like the Mouse and the E100 and stuff like that. And we make fun of them today, but he was basing that on the idea that they would have access to the Caucasian oil fields and that the Soviets would keep making bigger KVs and ISs. And
The
he was
KV
trying to
one
predict
is it?
that.
Or no, the KV 2 is. I'm sorry, this is a side tangent. Is the funniest tank I've ever seen. It's the one where it's like,
The
it's
fridge turret.
yeah, it's the gigantic like box turret with the huge gun in the front, and it's like just a walking target or moving target.
Yeah, but my point is like he was wrong, but it's like it's not. Also, the Mouse was designed to be produced in like a couple dozen as a anti-fortification tank. But my point is, like you could say with Churchill, a lot of what happened, he not maybe didn't predict, or he made a particular calculation at the time, and a lot of it didn't work out, but it's not necessarily, I think, reflective of him. I admit, just because my background is Anglo-Canadian, I always have a bit of a soft spot for him.
Like
uh
I
also
go ahead.
I have a letter from Churchill.
hmm
My one of my my great grandparents sent him fan mail, and he wrote back a note. So
Oh, nice. What did it say?
just thank you.
hmm
Thank you for that. I think he was a Mennonite, and he sent him like a psalm or something. He's like, "Thank you, that's very kind."
hmm Yeah, I
Um,
think he was a good man. I just don't think he was, he was neither the demon nor the angel that I think people have to portray him as. He is, he's a complicated figure, and unfortunately, people can't, because the narrative world of World War II has to be explicitly black and white. You can't see him as anything other than like a saint that knew exactly what he was doing the entire time. And Like, wasn't his family not even very liked, anyways? Like, the Churchills have been around for hundreds of years, and like they're just kind of this backwater noble family. Because I
Well,
remember there
Duke
was
of
like a
Marlborough.
yeah.
Sorry,
Can
sir,
I?
you're trying to say something. Go ahead.
Oh, I just think that we don't necessarily have to have positive opinions about the leaders in World War II. We can have opinions about them based on reality. I have a somewhat negative opinion of Churchill. I don't view him very positively, but I mean, we don't I don't think outside of France, de Gaulle is particularly uh, you know,
He's kind of hated in Canada.
yeah, he's not viewed that positively outside of France. Is Mackenzie King in Canada viewed as like some kind of savior?
Um, it's no, I think, and I could be wrong. After the war, he refused to take any Jews, and he said none is too many.
Mm-hmm.
So he's kind of based.
Um, yeah, something like that.
I do know that there is the heartwarming story that de Gaulle had a daughter with Down syndrome, but like didn't just send her off to an asylum and decided just to treat her like anybody else.
The thing with de Gaulle, and my grandfather hated de Gaulle, was de Gaulle went to Quebec and said "Vive la Quebec libérée" or whatever.
Okay.
So my grandfather blames him for Quebec separatism.
Mm-hmm.
But uh, what do we talk about? How do you two feel about Mustache Man?
I think that, as I've said, my views can probably be centered around what the Kaiser said about him. That he builds armies, but he doesn't build a nation. He doesn't have a god to honor or a dynasty. He's a very sincere man, but he doesn't really understand the basis of what a nation actually is. I don't think he was as insane as, of course, the narrative makes him out to be. I think he probably got more insane as the war went on, and I think Serp would have made this point, right? Is that, you know, wars tend to make countries become more. They intensify like war crimes as wars become more intense. The what they were going to do to the Jews escalated as the war went on, whereas it might not have had they not been at war.
I think that that's absolutely true. Thinking about German war crimes, as the nation became more and more desperate and the war became more and more existential, the war crimes increased in frequency and intensity. But when it comes to Hitler, I think that Hitler has to be measured as on basis of what he did. And what he did is launch a foolhardy war, which forever destroyed and relinquished German power, and resulted in Germans being expelled from much of their native homeland. Germany is, still
The pariah.
doesn't still made a pariah in Europe, I guess. Europeans generally have very negative opinions of Germany and German culture. Germany does not have a very powerful standing army. Still has large military bases from the United States, and the German people went through a lot of suffering through this defeat. World War II, I think, ultimately is a product, despite looking at it more closely in its origins. World War II is a product of German aggression and Hitler's foolhardiness. Had Hitler been slower to, first of all, had Hitler not contested the corridor and Danzig, had World War II never have happened, Hitler would be viewed as one of the greatest, if not the greatest, German leaders ever. Had he died in, say, 1939 and had created Gross Deutschland and rebuilt the German economy, he would be lauded as one of the greatest German leaders in all of the nation's history. But I mean, David Irving believes that he had this paranoia about him dying, and becoming too old to lead Germany in a war, and that pushed him to being aggressive and forcing his hand in starting World War II, or not. He pushed for numerous territorial expansion on the back, multiple over and over and over and over again, to where he pushed this unnecessary war for Germany over the Danzig corridor. The Soviet Union was completely isolated with, even France and Britain willing to defend Finland during the middle of World War II against Germany, against the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union was completely hated, but by wanting to have this war with the Soviet Union and wanting to expand Germany aggressively over such short of a period of time, he resulted in Germans being expelled from East Prussia, from
West Prussia, Silesia, East Pomerania.
Silesia, and a large portion of Germany being occupied by the Soviet Union and being a puppet state for decades.
Not to mention the horrifying war crimes that the Soviets committed on German women as well.
Yes, yeah. The World War II was unnecessary. This was Hitler's war. It was a product of Hitler's aggression, and Hitler is a failure.
Mm-hmm.
He has to be viewed as a failure, which brought a terrible storm on his nation.
Even
permanently altered it.
Mm-hmm. Even
forever.
More broadly politically is because of him. Like, in the 1920s, and I guess until him, fascism was still kind of like in vogue. It was cool. Like, people thought Mussolini was kind of interesting, even if you weren't a fascist. Like, but because of like his intense racialism, when it happened with Hitler, it just kind of it got rid of any kind of acceptance of a third alternative or anything that is to the right of, as you said, Roosevelt, and basically made any opposition to liberalism extremely difficult to where it is now.
Well, because you can just anything that happens, and this is why. So I don't think there's any value in trying to relitigate World War II and say Hitler was actually a good dude or whatever. But I do think at some point we're going to have to try to do something about the use of the Holocaust to justify literally everything.
To justify literal holocausts, like the fact of Israel justifying what they do to the Palestinians because, the Holocaust happened to us.
Like, we have to have gay marriage because of the Holocaust. We have to
accept unlimited immigration.
We have to have affirmative action because of the Holocaust. We have to have unlimited immigration. So it is just used for literally every single thing. And it always comes up, and everyone always gets compared to Hitler and stuff like that. So I think from that perspective, it probably needs to be eventually brought up. I don't know if now is really a good time for that.
The thing is that if you're looking at it like attacking a defensive position, that is where all of their guns of liberalism is like defenses and guns are lined up on right? Is anything questioning that? I mean, it is illegal in numerous countries in Europe to actually talk about it. So
and Canada, I think they passed legislation recently that banned any discussion of a certain historical event as the human instrumentality project, as I like to call it.
I mean, you don't have to deny that it happened. Like, again, as I pointed out, I believe it happened. It's more, and even litigating the details of it, I don't think is as important as the fact that, as you said, that and just, everybody that is slightly opposed to whatever Democrats want is Hitler.
I think you do need to push back. We have to push back hard when they bring it up. Like, do you have something else? Like, have you?
Mm-hmm.
Just something else that's stupid.
Was America committing the Holocaust in the 50s when they didn't have gay marriage?
Yeah, well, it's retarded. It just constantly comes up, and everything is. And
also, don't look up what American GIs thought about racial integration during World War II.
Yeah, it's... Well, then you get into the schizo post that the Allies were the real racists. But
I mean, you had you had Asians, you had Indians, you had Africans all fighting on the Axis side. So they were a monument to diversity.
Well, that's kind of Japan viewed itself as an anti-colonial power
I mean,
and
that was their kind
used
of
anti-colonial.
that was their justification to just try and create their empire. I mean,
Mhm.
like the Japanese war crimes were, pretty much just as, if not even more horrifying.
Oh yeah, we haven't talked about it. So what do you guys think about Japan in World War II?
I think it's actually a little more clear of their role. I mean, they had a huge fear of becoming a second rate or third rate power next to, say, the Soviet Union and the United States. I think that, due to them still having growing pains of growing out of their pre-modern and into a modernist era, state, into a modern industrialized state, and the fact that they also got a little drunk on victory, the fact that they won the war against China in 1891, they were able to annex all of Korea, they defeated the Russian Empire in 1905, they were on the winning side in World War One. And that they weren't really checked that much. I mean, I think they were part of the. Did they sign on to the London Naval Treaty in the 20s?
Yeah, I think so.
Uh, you just kind of had that. You had the. But then, of course, you had the economic downturn that was also kind of. This happened a couple years before, but the Great Kanto earthquake also severely damaged Japan's economy, and I felt like it was just. I was gonna say they had the manlet problem of them having a bit of a Napoleon complex, of just trying to act bigger than they ultimately, trying to bite off more than they could chew. Like I think it's true that Roosevelt did try and trigger the war, but at the same time, like Japan was waging a brutal invasion of China, largely just because they wanted territory there.
It's so I read a biography of Emperor Showa. So it was kind of I think it was written by like a Western an anti-American leftist or something. But he said that America demanded that Japan withdraw from all of its colonial territories. And they're like, does that include Korea and Manchuria? And America was very ambiguous about it. So
Mm-hmm.
they might have been willing to make some sort of agreement if they had have been allowed to keep those. I think Japan probably would have surrendered a lot earlier or sought a negotiated settlement if they would have been allowed to keep Manchuria and Korea and Taiwan.
Mm-hmm.
But I think that might actually be the worst precedent of World War II. The idea that you can never have negotiations and everything has to be
All
total
or
victory.
nothing. Yeah.
Like they will not like for instance in Ukraine, they will not negotiate with Putin.
Mm-hmm.
Even early war where the deal was, in my opinion, quite generous, they refused to negotiate.
I think, yeah, if anybody should be tried for war crimes, because again, we have to put anybody that we don't like on trial for in Nuremberg trials, is but Boris Johnson is responsible for a lot of the deaths in Ukraine because he deliberately sabotaged a peace negotiation.
And I mean, once again, you can agree with that, you can disagree with that, you can think it was in good faith or bad faith, but the general idea is you can just have no negotiate. And you also see this with I feel how the US deals with China is they can't try to come to some sort of understanding or um detente or sphere of influence agreement.
I think it comes from like the haughtiness of the idea that refusing to accept the idea that we live in a multipolar world, that the US, like the State Department, still thinks that the US can just bully any country it doesn't like and talk down to them, and not expect them to, and if they think China or treating other countries like they're third rate powers and not actually have some level of parity with the United States. Like they still think Russia is just this backwards post-Soviet state where everybody is just a raging alcoholic and like their army is completely incompetent.
So I think that the Gulf War and the Iraq War caused for very dubious reasons caused America to think its military is invincible against another standing army. And there's Saddam's military in those conflicts is not even representative of Arab standing armies, which are notoriously the weakest of any region. Arab standing armies are the most weak standing armies. And so I think going into the Ukraine war, and I think this has to go with like Hillary's belief that she could impose a no-fly zone against like the Russian Air Force in Syria and stuff like that. I think that the United States military planners legitly thought that if there was some kind of war between the Russian Federation and the United States alone, or the United States with NATO, or even Ukraine plus American help, that the Russian Federation is just some kind of bigger form of Iraq that would just be completely blown the fuck out by maneuver warfare and air superiority over a course of like days or weeks.
I've seen articles on that where they basically just said, like, we expected the Russians to act like Iraq, and when they didn't, we didn't have a backup plan. I do think that was getting high off of their own supply, but once again, it's the idea we can't negotiate, we can't try to come to any kind of agreement. We just have to crush everybody because of Neville Chamberlain, because that was the only time there was ever negotiations in human history. Was Neville Chamberlain.
Even though throughout the entirety of the Cold War, negotiations worked out pretty well.
Yeah, I mean, Détente worked out decently well.
Yeah, we're all still here. We didn't all die in a nuclear fire.
I mean, Minsk, too, worked out pretty well for a while, didn't it?
Mm-hmm.
I think so. But like once again, also I'm not going to get too much into the Russo-Ukraine war, but ultimately I think it came down to the neutral status of Ukraine, and it was regarded as Ukraine being neutral was going to be Neville Chamberlain 2.0, so we had to start.
And the thing is that they've gotten so invested into this. Is that anything less than the capitulation of Russia's government and turning it into a liberal democracy is going to be seen as a complete disaster for, the State Department.
Also, do you think that part of it is the unwillingness to just take the L and move on?
Mm-hmm.
Is something that came out of World War II?
You kind of had that in World War I as well. It's like, basically, multiple countries were unwilling to take a slap in the face, and so just to save face, we're willing to go into a war that killed millions of people.
I mean, more like the Allies weren't willing to just have white peace, or
With
Germany white,
yeah,
or imperial, it's just
even when it was escalating, if like the Serbians had just said, okay, we'll let the Austrians investigate, or if they're like, if Russia...
To be fair, the Austrians had calibrated it so Serbia couldn't accept it.
I guess, but you kind of get what I mean, though, is that the breakdown of negotiation, I think pride had a lot to do with it.
Also, once again, I think the legalization, I think one of the cringiest terms of all time has to be the rules-based international order.
You can't evade because that's illegal.
It's like totalitarian statement, like a
well, because it doesn't,
so
like, the rules don't apply to like anyone. Well, I don't like stuff that's fake and G-slur, and it's really just fake and G-slur. The whole like, oh, America's is doing international law, and stuff like that. As Constantine points out, yeah, Serbia accepted 9 out of 10 Austrian demands. I think the last one was something crazy, but no, I just mean like towards the end of World War One. I think maybe, I don't know when exactly, both sides could have said, look, this thing was a mess. Let's just end it before more people die.
I think
there's not going to be a total thing.
Is when the Germans didn't want to sue for peace because not long into the war, Germany effectively just became a military dictatorship, and by like and eventually just became a dictatorship under Hindenburg and Ludendorff. They didn't want to make peace just because they're like, well, we're just a couple months away from having the advantage that we can finally break through. Whereas I think on the Allied side, it became more ideological once the United States entered in and said, we will never accept any form of peace that lets the Kaiser remain in the head of state.
Well, that was one of the reasons Japan didn't sue for peace, because they were afraid that they would remove the emperor.
Mm-hmm.
So, can I return to Japan?
Sure, be my guest, by all means.
So it's interesting that throughout this entire discussion, everything is centered around the European theater of war, and that even going back further, like talking about the politicization of World War II, I think that Japan's the war with Japan, its expansion into the Pacific and into China, is depoliticized, is a front or as a part of the war is depoliticized, that in the Western world we're able to discuss revisionism, that the Marco Polo Bridge wouldn't be a false flag, or that Japan could have been justified, or that the United States had prior knowledge about Pearl Harbor. These things are not explicitly banned from discourse because this war is historicized again, and the war is so historicized that to the normal person, and even the way that this entire discussion about the narrative of World War II is put forward, World War II is synonymous with the European War, when in terms of the amounts of death and in terms of the resources that were American and Canadian. America and Canada put a great deal of resource. It was not some kind of side front. Japan, was a very real threat to the United States. In fact, I think that if either of the two primary Axis powers were closer to winning, I think Japan actually was much closer to winning than Germany was.
If they had won at Midway, or if they had been able to destroy the carriers of Pearl Harbor, I think they could have actually. There's a chance they could have forced the U.S. to the negotiating table, because
naval battles can be very decisive. So if they had have gotten lucky a couple times and sunk a bunch of carriers, the U.S. might have had to.
Because it takes like several months to years to build up carriers, and like Jutland in World War One, they said that battle could have ended the war in an afternoon. If the Germans had won that decisively, they could have just then, okay, now we can just blockade the English Channel and just end the war right there.
Yes,
I think
naval battles.
Naval
battles by their nature are set pieces where if one side wins decisively, that it has permanent permanent results that last throughout for years to go on. And even if the United States, of course, by 1944 and after the Battle of the Coral Sea and the invasion of the Philippines and everything, the United States had unparalleled naval advantages over Japan. Had Japan locally defeated American naval forces, I think that it's kind of irrelevant for years, the industrial output that the United States would be able to bear against Japan. Japan would have been able to take the remainder of the Pacific holdings and would have been able to launch decisive attacks, maybe even an invasion or incursion into Australia, and would have been able to aid revolts against the British in India had there been a decisive defeat in Midway or at Guadalcanal or at Coral Sea, where the United States were defeated navally by the Japanese.
I think Karl Dönitz even said all wars are ultimately decided by naval power, which is a bit of a stretch, but I think in the Pacific theater, it's definitely true.
I meant, when I said Coral Sea, I meant the Philippine Sea.
Has anyone said, has anyone seen how sometimes it's even portrayed as the war against Japan was a racist colonial war?
I mean, because that's the one Allied war crime you are allowed to call out is the internment camps.
No, but like they'll pretend that the invasion of China never happened, and
Mm.
the only reason the Allies went to war with Japan was because they were racists who couldn't stand that
That a yellow
East
country.
Asians, yeah, the yellow man was having his time in the sun.
I don't
I,
think a
I
lot of people think of it that way. I think it's mainly, at least in the U.S., it's about like, oh, the internment camps and like the nuking of Nagasaki and Hiroshima, both of which I think were unjustified. But the point being is that you are allowed to talk about those. You're not allowed to talk about anything that happened in the European theater.
So here's a question I have, and this is something I've been pondering since the debate's been coming up. If America hadn't have used atomics to end World War II, would they be more widely used today? Because we wouldn't have a firsthand example of how destructive they are.
That's a good question.
Because I could see it going both ways, that if America hadn't have done it, there wouldn't. But the fact is that we haven't used them. Is that because when we did use them, it was so horrific, people understood their and respected their power?
I think there's a chance if because like footage would have gotten released of like when they did nuclear testing, that people would have probably gotten the same impression anyway.
I don't think it's as sensational, but that's
I
just me.
think I think that the use of nuclear weapons in World War II led to um, people not using them in a later war. I think that's definitely true. But can I go on like to a
Yeah.
long segue
Sure,
about
go
nuclear
ahead.
weapons in general?
Yep, go ahead.
I think that the power, even when you have like say 1960s, 1970s nuclear weapons where they're in the megatons, I think that the power of nuclear weapons is really grossly exaggerated through science fiction and through people like Carl Sagan and nuclear war theory, which has no basis. Um, into believing that they're much more powerful than they actually are, and that this perception that nuclear weapons, both in terms of how large their explosion is and the very, very exaggerated danger of persistent radioactivity from nuclear weapons, has led to people not being willing. The general public fears war much more than it would in past times. Perhaps this is actually a very good thing, but um, than is necessary. That nuclear weapons are very grossly exaggerated in their power, and it's possible that you could have a conventional war between great powers. Actually, I
Mm-hmm.
think that say Pakistan and India could engage in a conventional war against each other, or there could actually be this is very dangerous to say, of course, but there could be a wider conventional war with NATO and Russia over Ukraine, and that nuclear weapons wouldn't be
Or
used.
America and Iran, probably more likely.
America, well, I mean, it's different when you have one nuclear power versus a non-nuclear power in a conventional war with like the Korean War. It's interesting because with both like Ukraine and Korea, the Korean War, you have and Yom Kippur, you have a conventional power which could defeat a nuclear power, and the nuclear power doesn't use nuclear weapons.
Mm-hmm. All right. Well, we've been at this for almost 2 hours now. Is there anything you guys? Is there anything else you guys want to talk about in terms of like the narrative, or what do you think is going to go forward? Like, as we approach 80 years since the war. Actually, I think Serp already made this point, and it's similar with the Civil War too, right? Where the narrative kind of just remains sticky in wars like that, where it doesn't for others. But I feel like, yeah, like Old Glory Club, I might disagree with them about the magnitude of it, but if like at least what's discussed with the narrative is questioned, or at least if nuance is brought into it, of World War, of what happened in World War II, particularly in Europe, if that gets questioned, that is a massive blow to um, the liberal kind of narrative that it kind of relies on. I think especially just in terms of the things we talked about, how the idea of every conflict has to be a complete total war. There can be no negotiation, and anybody that we don't like has to be akin to Hitler.
I actually...
Go ahead.
Oh, sorry. I was going to say, I think a final thing is, do you think the narrative on World War II, and in particular a certain historical event, has changed at all because of the Israel-Hamas war?
I'm not... I mean, I think it might be that people that are on the pro-Palestinian side, especially the people that are not white, like, they don't have that same... a random, like, African or Latin American doesn't have that same, like... them hammering in how bad that was into their heads their whole life. So I think they have a different understanding where, like, that's just them, calling out the Holocaust is just not going to have the same effect as it does on white people.
I think that it's irrelevant that the target of Hitler's aggression was the Jews, and that opposition against Israel in favor of Palestine, even these Palestine protesters wanting Israel no longer to exist in many cases. I think that it's irrelevant because at one point, right, it changed from World War II was a war to defend Poland. World War II turned into the Nazis were trying to wipe out all Jews, so we had to stop them. And now it's evolved beyond the Holocaust, and German war crimes evolved far beyond the killing of Jews into this universal oppressor versus oppressed kind of like worldview, to where the Germans weren't fighting weren't trying to wipe out the Jews. They were trying to wipe out gays. They're apparently trying to wipe out blacks. I think it's just that the justification for Israel being World War II and what happened to them is kind of irrelevant. And I think that the left in the United States and in the wider West will identify with the Palestinians just kind of like knee-jerk because they identify with the loser now, based on this kind of like watered-down narrative of World War II.
Yeah, I don't know if the Holocaust, though, is going to have the same political, like, be as much of a political trump card as it was going forward.
Oh, I think it absolutely will be. I think that the
even
Holocaust
for
will
Jews?
be divorced. Yes, I think the Holocaust will be divorced from the Jewish part of it.
I think
the Holocaust.
No, but I'm saying it
divorced
might
from the Jewish
allow more
dimension.
criticism or discussion about.
I think keep this in mind is, like, we're now getting reparations bills, and the basis of that is, well, slavery from over 160 years ago.
Yeah, I see no. I think that throughout the entirety of my lifetime, World War II will remain political, as the U.S. Civil War remains political, and following 9/11, the Crusades were made political. There's no amount.
I mean, more the
backwards
Jewish
where something
centrism
can't
of
be
it.
political anymore.
I can understand that, Argent, that, it might evolve from less of it was just directly against the Jews to, well, it was against all. The war was really just against marginalized.
No, like I
people.
think Israel, it's harder, and this could be wrong, but I feel like whenever Israel tries to say the Holocaust now, there's more pushback against it than there would have been maybe a decade ago.
Like,
I don't know if that's naive on my point, but that's just.
I think you're right. I think maybe we're talking past each other.
Okay.
Mm-hmm. Like,
I don't mean that Hitler will be de-emphasized or World War II will be. I just think that it being the absolute shield to prevent all criticism of the Jewish people in Israel, I think that is probably going to change a bit, or has changed a bit.
I think that the Holocaust now within the United States amongst the left will be used against Jews in Israel. Will be used against Israel, actually.
They could use the idea of, well, you should know better then. Or, like, the Holocaust happened to us. Well, okay, that doesn't justify drone striking at Gaza hospital.
Yeah, I think that it's evolved to the point where it's the Holocaust is used against Israel, and that Israel is directly put in the place of the Nazis in the pop view of the Germans in World War II.
Yeah, I think you already see people making those comparisons anyway. So, all right. Is there anything else you'd like to finish up
Oh,
on?
that's good. I just figured that was a good thing to end on.
Yeah, I think just my final thoughts is like, yeah, I think it's important to at least try and get on people to understand nuance of history, because again, what's justified a lot of atrocities and or by liberal democracies is the narrative of World War II that we can do whatever we want to the Russians, or we can escalate as much as we want, because the concept of a negotiated peace basically means the end of the world if you believe in liberal democracy, which is really upsetting. But yeah, thank you, Serp. Thank you, Argent, for coming on. I guess I'll see
Anytime.
I'll see you guys.
Thank you.
Later.
Okay.
All right. Well, thank you for coming on this morning. This went longer than I thought it would.
Oh, that's fine. I think we had a good discussion.
Mm-hmm.